In an age of false assurances, one night shook the world's perception to its core. Israel, the so-called untouchable force, saw its skies pierced by Iranian missiles, and with those explosions, the silence that had settled over the Muslim world for decades was shattered. This was not just an attack, it was a message of strength, of dignity, of awakening. This video is not just news. It is the truth they never wanted you to hear. The truth the media hides, the truth that division tried to bury. This isn't just about Iran and Israel. This is about the entire Muslim Ummah. It is the cry of pain from Gaza, from Palestine, from Syria, Kashmir, Burma, from every land where blood was spilled and voices were silenced. And now one nation stood up not for power, but for purpose. In this video, you will hear what the world fears. You will see what the cameras avoid. And you will understand what can unite a broken nation once again. So don't look away. Watch till the very end, because every second, every word is a revelation that may open your eyes forever. This isn't just the truth, it's the bitter reality that could change everything. For decades, Israel built its image on being invincible. With cutting-edge technology, American backing, and a ruthless intelligence network, it projected the image of a fortress that could never be breached. Its Iron Dome was more than just a defense system. It was a symbol of supremacy, a shield of pride. Israel positioned itself as the regional powerhouse, daring any opponent to even try. But then came a night that shook that narrative. The myth of invincibility cracked under pressure, not because of numbers, but because of precision. Iran didn't need to destroy everything. It only needed to touch the right nerve, the right moment, the right message, and that's exactly what it did. That night, the world watched as missiles breached the layers of security, not in blind chaos, but with chilling coordination. The strikes didn't just damage infrastructure, they shattered the illusion that Israel was always 10 steps ahead. For the first time in years, sirens in Israeli cities weren't just drills. Panic was real. The Iron Dome, the pride of Israeli military engineering, faltered. The very system that was sold to the world as impenetrable showed its cracks. A handful of strikes made the world question everything they were told about Israel's strength. The air of superiority began to fade, replaced by silence, confusion, and unanswered questions. This wasn't about land or borders, it was about psychological dominance. Israel used its image to keep others in check. It didn't need to fight every time. It just needed people to believe they couldn't win. That's what was shattered. Iran didn't just fire weapons, it fired fearlessness. It challenged the idea that Israel can act without consequence, that it can suppress, bomb, and occupy without any blowback. And it did this not through rhetoric, but through calculated retaliation, the kind of retaliation that forces a superpower to pause, to reconsider, to worry. For many, it was just a military exchange, but for those watching closely, it was a moment in history, a moment where the tide shifted, where David stood up to Goliath, not with stones, but with strength of will. Israel's image was wounded. And with that wound came doubt. Doubt in the minds of its supporters, doubt in the halls of Western power, doubt in the hearts of those who always thought resistance was useless. Because when the untouchable gets touched, the game changes. This is what pride looks like when it's confronted with truth. This is what happens when arrogance is met with strategy. Iran didn't destroy Israel that night, but it did something far more dangerous. It exposed the myth It showed the world that even giants can bleed. And in doing so, it gave a voice to every nation, every people, every heart that's been silenced under the weight of false superiority. That night became a mirror. And in it, the world saw not Israel's power, but its limits. When Iran launched its missiles, it wasn't just a military act. It was a carefully crafted message, delivered through the language of strength. Each missile, each target, each second was chosen with intention. This wasn't chaos. This was clarity. Iran wasn't lashing out blindly. It was communicating something the world needed to hear, that sovereignty, dignity, and justice are not negotiable. That when lines are crossed, silence is not the only option, that the oppressed have a voice. And sometimes that voice speaks in thunder. For years, Iran had been on the receiving end of sanctions, threats, and media narratives. But this moment wasn't about retaliation, it was about restoration. Iran's strike was a strategic answer to years of humiliation and provocation. It wasn't about showing off military muscle. It was about saying, we see what's happening and we're not afraid anymore. This was not war for the sake of war. It was defense wrapped in defiance. Iran knew the risks. It understood the consequences. But still, it chose to rise. Because some moments in history demand courage over calculation. Some moments require a nation to stand tall, even if the world chooses to look away. Iran's action wasn't for applause. It was for awareness. It wanted the world to wake up from its selective silence, to feel the discomfort of truth that's been buried beneath politics. The message Iran sent was also directed at the Muslim world. It was a wake-up call, a jolt to the soul of nations that have remained spectators. It wasn't just a strike, it was a reminder that resistance is not just possible, it's necessary. That justice doesn't beg, it demands. For too long, injustice has been normalized, dressed up in the language of diplomacy and peacekeeping, while bombs fall on civilians and homes are reduced to rubble. Iran's message was clear. The days of one-sided pain are over. The narrative doesn't belong to the powerful anymore. It belongs to those who choose to stand, even when standing is dangerous. And to the West, Iran's message cut even deeper. It said, we hear your threats, but we don't fear them. It said, you can isolate us economically, but you can't erase our resolve. The strike exposed not only military weaknesses, but also moral ones. It forced Western powers to rethink their assumptions, to question whether their dominance is still It revealed that there are still nations in the world that don't bow, won't break, and won't stay quiet when their people are pushed against the wall. It reminded them that while they were busy building narratives, others were building courage. This was not just about Iran. It was about every silenced voice, every unmarked grave, every mother who buried her child under the weight of bombs disguised as justice. Iran sent a message for all of them, and in doing so, it rewrote the rules of engagement, not just in war, but in truth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak without words and let the world feel your silence break through the noise. The night Iranian missiles struck Israeli targets, something even louder than the explosions echoed across the world. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from fear, confusion, and discomfort. The kind that exposes the truth people are too afraid to say out loud. When the news broke, you didn't see emergency press conferences from Western leaders. There were no viral hashtags, no global campaigns of solidarity, no outrage from the usual defenders of so-called democracy. The media tiptoed, The politicians paused. The powerful hesitated. And in that hesitation, something powerful was revealed. The world wasn't ready for this moment because the truth is, they didn't expect Iran to move and succeed. For decades, the narrative was simple. Israel was always in control, always protected, always one step ahead. Iran was cast as the villain, isolated, unstable, surrounded by sanctions and suspicion. But the events of that night flipped the script. When Iran struck with precision, the expected playbook didn't work. There was no instant condemnation that could unite the usual allies, no blanket defense of Israel that could comfortably fit into the same recycled sound bites. Instead, there was a stunned silence, a hesitation that spoke volumes. The West didn't know how to respond because the image of a weakened Israel and a bold strategic Iran wasn't supposed to exist in their version of the story. This silence wasn't weakness, it was exposure. It showed how deep the hypocrisy runs. The same governments that cry foul when their allies are threatened suddenly had nothing to say. The same voices that demand justice when a Western nation is attacked chose diplomacy and delay. But the people watching saw it. The world's Muslims, the oppressed, the unheard. They saw the double standard in full view. When Gaza is bombed, there's justification. When resistance strikes back, there's silence. That silence doesn't neutralize the truth, it amplifies it. It shows who truly stands for justice and who only pretends to when it suits their interest. This silence was also fear. Fear that if they speak, they might trigger something they can't control. Fear that acknowledging Iran's capability would admit their own vulnerability. Fear that the balance of power they've worked so hard to preserve might be shifting right in front of them. That fear paralyzed them. And in that paralysis, Iran didn't just strike Israel, it struck the global order that shields it. That silence was the sound of a narrative crumbling. It was the moment the mask slipped and the world saw that even the loudest powers can be silenced by reality. For every Palestinian who screamed into the void and was ignored, for every nation punished for simply defending its dignity, that silence was justice in its purest form. The West could not spin this moment. They could not drown it in headlines or deflect it with distractions. They had to sit with it. And in doing so, they revealed their discomfort with a truth they could no longer hide. Because sometimes silence is not peace. It's surrender to a reality they never thought they'd face. The Iranian strike didn't just send shock waves through Tel Aviv, it sent a tremor through the Arab world, shaking every silent capital, every comfortable leader, every nation that had made peace with injustice. For years, many Arab governments chose normalization over resistance, silence over solidarity, and deals over dignity. They watched Gaza burn, watched children buried under rubble, watched the West rewrite history, and they stayed quiet. Some even applauded Israel behind closed doors, hoping their loyalty would buy them safety, security, or favor. But the night Iran fired those missiles, that silence became deafening. It became a mirror reflecting the betrayal that the people of the Muslim world have felt for so long. When Iran moved, it wasn't just challenging Israel, it was challenging every Arab regime that had bowed their heads while Palestine bled. It exposed the cowardice of leaders who claimed to represent Islam but remained mute in the face of oppression. It showed that while they built towers and signed treaties, the soul of the Ummah is crying out for justice. not compromise. Iran didn't just fight with weapons, it fought with conviction. And that conviction embarrassed those who had given up long ago. Arab streets erupted not in anger at Iran, but in respect. The people remembered what it means to have pride, to defend honor, to say no to tyranny, even if it means standing alone. That night, millions of Arabs saw something their own governments haven't shown in decades: courage, real courage, the kind that refuses to be bought, the kind that doesn't wait for permission from the West, the kind that answers injustice not with silence, but with strength. And that's why the reaction from Arab leaders wasn't loud, it was muted, strategic, uncomfortable. Because Iran had just done what they never dared to do. It had challenged the global order. It had stood up to a nuclear-backed regime. It had shattered the illusion that Israel was untouchable. And in doing so, it made every silent leader look smaller, weaker, exposed. The strike didn't ask for permission. It didn't follow the diplomatic playbook. It acted. And in that action, it revived a spirit that many thought was dead. A spirit of resistance, of unity, of unapologetic strength. Iran reminded the Arab world that the fight for justice isn't over, and that those who have abandoned it are being left behind. The youth on the streets know this. The scholars in exile know this. The people in the camps know this. And now, thanks to Iran's boldness, even the silent rulers are being forced to acknowledge it. This wasn't just an act of war, it was an act of truth. A truth that pierced through oil deals and summit smiles. A truth that no regime can hide from its people forever. Because no matter how many walls they build or treaties they sign, they can't stop the rising awareness of a generation that now sees who really stands for Palestine and who merely stands for power. In the immediate aftermath of Iran's missile strike, a strange shift occurred, not on the battlefield, but on the screens of millions. Western media, known for their quick, rehearsed condemnations of anything that challenges their narrative, suddenly slowed down. The headlines didn't scream terrorism like they used to. The talk shows didn't jump to demonize Iran like they did in decades past. In fact, for a moment there was confusion, a moment of hesitation, a moment where the machinery of media propaganda didn't know how to spin the truth fast enough. And that moment cracked something deeper, the illusion of control over global perception. The West's ability to dominate the narrative with lies, omissions, and distortions began to waver. And for the first time in a long time, the world started to ask, what if the so-called villain isn't a villain at all? This wasn't because Iran suddenly became the hero of the Western press. It's because the facts were too loud to ignore. The precision of the strike, the calm in Iran's messaging, and the exposed vulnerabilities of Israel all disrupted the usual story. It wasn't chaos, it was calculated. It wasn't mindless aggression, it was measured resistance. The footage, the numbers, the images, they told a story that was too clear to deny. And when the narrative couldn't be twisted in real time, the usual response from media outlets turned into strategic silence, awkward avoidance, or painfully obvious bias. But viewers noticed, people noticed. Across Europe, in America, in the East and the West, people saw through the noise. This shift wasn't just about one event. It was the result of years of growing distrust in mainstream media. From Iraq to Syria to Palestine, the world has seen how easily truth is buried and how quickly lies are sold. But now, with the rise of alternative media, citizen journalism, and voices from the ground, The monopoly is breaking. And this strike, this single moment of defiance, pushed that crack wider. People began to question, if they lied about this, what else are they lying about? Why are Muslim lives treated like numbers? Why is resistance always labeled terrorism when it doesn't come from the West? Iran didn't just strike militarily, it struck the credibility of an entire system built on shaping perceptions. And in that system, perception is power. When the media can no longer control how people feel, fear, or react, then the real truth begins to rise. This is why the silence was so dangerous for them, because silence made space for reflection. Silence allowed the world to hear other voices, see other angles, and most importantly, feel a different kind of truth, one that's been buried under decades of carefully crafted lies. Iran's action didn't just shake missiles from the sky, it shook the foundations of narrative control. For Muslims especially, this moment held deeper meaning. It revealed how selective justice has become. It reminded them that the truth doesn't need approval to be truth, it only needs courage to be spoken and clarity to be seen. Iran gave that clarity, and the world, whether it admitted it or not, saw it. What happened when Iran fired those missiles wasn't just a military response. It was a moment that reignited something buried deep within the Muslim world, the fading flame of unity. For decades, the Ummah has been fragmented by borders, divided by politics, and weakened by sectarian narratives. Sunni versus Shia, Arab versus Persian, conservative versus liberal. Labels created and fueled by external forces to keep the house divided. But when Iran struck, something remarkable happened. Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia, from Cairo to Karachi, began to see beyond those lines. Social media lit up with support, streets filled with chants, not for Iran's supremacy, but for Muslim pride. It was as if the strike reminded a sleeping giant of who it really is. A body broken, but not destroyed. This wasn't a celebration of war. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the longing for dignity. For decades, Muslims have watched their brothers and sisters slaughtered in Palestine, humiliated in Kashmir, exiled in Syria, imprisoned in China, and mocked in Western media. All while many of their own leaders stood by in silence. But on this night, when the world expected Iran to remain silent, it answered. And in doing so, it spoke on behalf of millions who have had no voice. That act, whether agreed with politically or not, sent a message to the hearts of the oppressed. You are not forgotten, you are not weak, and you are not alone. What followed was not unity in political alliances, but unity in sentiment. The old sectarian barriers started to look small in the face of such boldness. People didn't see Shia or Sunni. They saw a Muslim nation standing up against decades of aggression, double standards, and unchecked occupation. And in a world that constantly tells Muslims they are too divided to stand, this was a moment that proved otherwise. This was proof that when injustice crosses a line, the identity of Islam still beats stronger than any political difference. The impact of this shift cannot be underestimated. It sent a signal to Muslim youth who have grown up in a world where Muslim lands are always the battlefield and Muslim voices are always silenced. It told them that the Ummah is not dead, that courage still exists, that power doesn't always wear a suit or sit in a palace. It sometimes comes from defiance, from resistance, from truth spoken loudly in the face of fear. Iran's strike forced millions to remember the strength of a united ummah and the weakness of a divided one. More than anything, it revealed that the only thing more dangerous than a missile is the awakening of a people, because once hearts unite, once purpose returns, once Muslims across the globe begin to see each other not as strangers but as family, then the game changes entirely. Iran's actions weren't just about Israel. They were about waking the soul of a nation without borders. And the world is beginning to realize once again the power of that awakening. But what we are witnessing right now is not just the fall of illusions, it is the rise of clarity. Iran's response to Israeli aggression was more than a military move. It was a bold declaration to a world long blinded by bias and silence. It exposed weaknesses, not just in defense systems, but in narratives. It reminded silent regimes that history doesn't remember cowards. It remembers those who stood tall when the world expected them to kneel. And most importantly, it reignited a fire in the heart of the Muslim Ummah, a fire of dignity, a fire of unity, a fire that the oppressors thought they had extinguished long ago, but now it burns brighter than ever. This moment, this global awakening, is proof that no matter how dark the night gets, the spirit of truth cannot be buried forever. Iran may have pulled the trigger, but what echoed was the voice of millions Muslims, oppressed people, and truth seekers across the globe, rising with one message: enough is enough. And that message has only just begun to shake the world. Thank you for standing with truth, for seeking knowledge beyond headlines, and for keeping your heart connected to justice. This is not just a video, it's a movement. A call to wake up, speak up, and rise up. May Allah guide us all towards strength, wisdom, and unity. Good luck, and never forget, when the world doubts you, stand firm, because the truth always finds its voice.